logically. And when you're the steward of the people, not just of the nuclear button, your responsibility is to act in a manner that your words are going to carry weight to the country. And somehow when he got before that crowd and the anger that was within him bubbled up from inside, and that certainly didn't help the situation, even help the acceptance now if they do put this Mr. Kavanaugh into the Supreme Court. What you needed the president to do was to be a healing force and say that her testimony was credible, but perhaps they're going to claim the FBI report didn't corroborate it. But he already made it into a partisan situation, which is going to make healing from this decision harder, make the Supreme Court's legitimacy harder, make the FBI harder now, which is the opposite of what you hope a leader would do.
And the presidents you profile in your new book, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Leadership in Turbulent Times, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson, all of them were faced with one crisis or another. Nothing was more intense, obviously, than the Civil War itself. We haven't had a crisis with this president. And if you think about JFK at the time of the Cuba crisis in 1962, what I take away from it is that Kennedy was being badgered by his Joint Chiefs of Staff, and particularly by Curtis LeMay, to, nuke Cuba and preemptively take out the Russian missiles. Well, we learned in retrospect that the Russian officers in charge of the nuclear weapons they had in Cuba had orders to fire these weapons in a counterforce strike without having to get approval from the Kremlin. So had JFK listened to Curtis LeMay and his Joint Chiefs of Staff, we would have had a nuclear war back in 1962. My fear is that with this particularly unstable president we have, he doesn't have, except for James Mattis, who's apparently on his way out, he doesn't have sober people around him. He has sycophants and hawks like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. They're likely to goad him in a crisis situation as opposed to restrain him.
And I think the worrisome thing about the experience with JFK, and this experience now too, is that JFK had learned from the mistakes of the Bay of Pigs that he couldn't rely on intelligence from above, that he couldn't rely on his generals. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made and restructured his White House to bring Bobby Kennedy closer into the decision-making structure, all of which meant when he came to that decision in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was much better prepared because he had learned through his growth. And that's one of the things that we keep looking for. Indeed, I do in all my leaders. They somehow were able to acknowledge their errors, learn from their mistakes. As Lincoln said, I'd like to believe I'm smarter today than I was yesterday because I've learned what I did wrong. And it's that learning process that we have not yet seen. We keep waiting for, and it hasn't happened. And then you are more liable to listen to advice from somebody else without bringing in the people that can really question your assumptions. That's one of the things that Lincoln did by having those rivals in his cabinet. They could all argue with him. So when he had to make a decision, he could take their alternative points of view into consideration.
And again, I'm speaking with Doris Kearns Goodwin, a world-renowned presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times #1 best-selling author who worked for Lyndon Johnson in the White House and later assisted him on his memoirs, which led to her best-selling Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. Her other books include the Pulitzer Prize-winning No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Home Front in World War II, and the runaway bestseller Team of Rivals, the basis for Steven Spielberg's Academy Award-winning film Lincoln, for which she earned the Lincoln Prize. And her latest book, just out, is Leadership in Turbulent Times. And Doris will be speaking and signing books tonight at the Aratani Theater, the Japanese American Cultural Center at 244 St. Pedro Street in downtown Los Angeles at 8 p.m. Well, in the example of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who took office in 1933, where people were starving in the streets and there were food riots, etc., what I found interesting about that, in terms of contrasting it to the 2008 crash, which I think is the closest contrast you can make, President Obama is being criticized now by people like George Soros and others who are basically saying he should have followed the advice of George W. Bush's Secretary of Treasury and other Wall Street types. He should have done what FDR did, because between the election of FDR and taking office in January of 1933, the incumbent Hoover was begging FDR to help him out, and FDR didn't. So do you think there's a lesson there?
Interesting. I mean, FDR understood that he needed a clear line of demarcation when he took office, that would show that something new was beginning, even though he used the Hoover advisors when he decided he wanted to have an emergency banking bill to close the banks and come up with some system that could shore up the weaker banks and then let the stronger ones stay open again once they reopened the doors. But in public, he thought it was important that he showed that this is a new situation that's developing, because the country was going on a downward slide and you had to feel that something new was happening. But I think also the difference is when FDR presented his emergency banking bill to the Congress, Republicans and Democrats immediately came together to support it. You know, and one of the criticisms that's sometimes made of President Obama is, why wasn't the stimulus bill larger? Well, he could barely get this one through on the Republican side. So there was never able to be that bipartisanship that was in the Depression, because perhaps the crisis was greater, so people were willing to put partisanship aside, and they weren't still in that period of time during the recession of '08.
And of course, two of your presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, were accidental presidents, I guess, if that's the way to put it, having their presidents assassinated. So let's just touch on Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, you write about the coal strike. He, of course, his great legacy is antitrust, and there's a growing call in this country for some movement on antitrust. It's all but moribund. And there are these huge tech companies now. It used to be only, 10 years ago that ExxonMobil was the most powerful company in the world. But now you've got Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Facebook. These are the most powerful companies, Amazon, and they're going to be more powerful. So do you think that is the legacy that has to be revived? I mean, not only revive antitrust, but, my God, think about the people that back then, in terms of the muckrakers, Ida Tarbell, who leaked all the important information about the Standard Oil Trust, and, of course, Mark Twain. So, two questions, I guess. What happened to the muckrakers? And two, when are we going to see some antitrust action?
Well, I think you raise a really interesting parallel between the situation at the turn of the 20th century and where we are right now, because that Gilded Age was an age when you had the first time a real gap between the rich and the poor, when the Industrial Revolution had shaken up the economy, much as the tech revolution and globalization have done today, when you had immigrants coming into the country, when there were big companies swallowing up small companies, and the inequities of the age were so glaring. And luckily, Teddy Roosevelt came along and not only broke up the big companies to some extent, but he also understood that you had to have a square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker, and instituted a series of regulations of big business, of the railroads, of the various companies that were important to get government into this mix of private enterprise. And we're facing a similar situation today. Again, the rural areas still cut off from the cities, just as they did at the turn of the 20th century. You had all these inventions at the turn of the 20th century, the automobile and the telephone and the telegraph, which made people anxious and wanting to go back to an earlier time. And of course, we have the same pace of life today. So, but the answer calls for looking at the situation and trying to make the situation better, and whether some of those steps are antitrust, whether they're regulation, or whether they're, as Teddy was saying, a square deal on both sides, I think is what is in called for today. But we have to think about how to deal with this economy and the social and cultural divisions that are facing us today, and how to make it more equitable so that people feel a sense of being common. Teddy Roosevelt said the rock of democracy would founder at the time when people no longer regarded each other as Americans, but rather as the other from different classes, sections, or regions. And you're right about Ida Tarbell. I mean, she's my hero in a lot of ways. A woman who was able to investigate the unfair means by which Standard Oil had reached its eminence, and eventually her research helped to break up Standard Oil. But then, of course, all the little Standard Oils became huge companies, including Exxon, as you point out.
But in terms of journalism, obviously, the New York Times and Washington Post are doing an extraordinary job, but we do have what is referred to as reality shopping, where liberals get their information from MSNBC and conservatives from Fox. So there's no consensus anymore in this country about what is real and what is true. Is that something that, I'm thinking about the days of Uncle Walter Cronkite reading the news, where everybody, that was sort of the gospel. Is that gone forever, or were there other periods in our history when we had, as Kellyanne Conway referred to, alternative facts?
Well, it is true that in the 1850s, when the main way you got your news was from your partisan subscription to your own Whig paper or Democratic paper or Republican paper, you would definitely hear alternative facts in their descriptions of events. I mean, that's because they were projecting to the partisans. But then national newspapers began to develop, partly because of reporters covering the Civil War. And by the turn of the century, you had all sorts of national newspapers. When the radio came in and FDR was able to speak to the country with one voice over a radio that 8 out of 10 people would be listening to, sure, there'd be other radio stations and editorials on them, but his voice was able to give a consistent message that everybody listened to, more than entertainment, more than sporting events. They're sitting in their kitchens or living rooms listening to him. And then, as you point out, when the 3 television networks were there, JFK and Ronald Reagan were able to speak with one voice. At least on the facts could be agreed on, even though the opinions might be different about them. Then once we got the split up of the cable news, once we got social media, once we got people just looking in their own silos, it's made it much, much harder. There's got to be an answer to it. I'm not sure I can think of what it is right now, but, you know, we've had problems before. As FDR said, problems created by man can be solved by man. So somewhere out there's ways we can think about how to draw a common press together that people respect and look at in the same way. But first we have to heal some of these cultural divisions that underlay the reason why they listen to their own preferred press.
So let's turn to President Lyndon Johnson, who you work for, and your husband Richard Goodwin also worked for him, and I used to interview Richard many years ago.
No kidding.
Yeah,
oh, boy.
Yeah, it feels like such a bygone era when you think about how much LBJ accomplished, the Civil Rights Act, 64, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, and so much more. So I guess the question that comes to mind is, what happened to the liberals in this country? When you think back at LBJ's time and how much he got done, and for quite some time after, all the way through the 70s, the liberals dominated the Senate, the House, and the Supreme Court. I mean, arguably, when we talk about liberals on the Supreme Court, many of them could be really categorized as centrists, not like the real liberals that we had back in those days with William O. Douglas and Thurgood Marshall, etc. So it feels to me, and I don't know what the answer is, but somehow when you look at what happened today, where the Republicans just rolled the Democrats and they're going to buffalo this guy onto the Supreme Court, and he's so troubling because he's so nakedly partisan that if you're a Democrat or a Democratic governor going before the Supreme Court with Brett Kavanaugh on the bench, you are not going to be treated fairly. That's just obvious. So am I correct in suggesting something happened where we had a liberal majority in this country and in all branches of the government, and now we seem to have a conservative majority in all branches of the government?
Well, I think there was a shared story that the liberals shared and that, you know, liberal Republicans would share with them, which was, especially on civil rights, that in order for the country to move forward, you know, segregation had to end in the South. Then when Johnson gave the famous "We Shall Overcome" speech that my husband, I'm so proud of saying, worked on with him, he's saying this is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, it's not a Democratic problem, it's not a Republican problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It's an American problem, and we are met here to solve that problem. There was a sense, I think, of common citizenry that allowed LBJ, for example, during that time, to get Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, to come with him on that civil rights bill to break the filibuster. That's an impossible situation to imagine today, that you could mobilize 22 people from the opposite side to go with the 44 Northern Democrats and break that filibuster and change the face of the country. And somewhere along the line, we still need a story now from the liberals and from the Democrats that binds us together as a nation, that understands why these people who felt left out of the system, felt that elites were running the system, whether Trump answered any of their concerns or not, they have to feel part of the solution that's going forward. And to some extent, I think there's so many silos, so many identity politics that have been going on, and there's a narrative that needs to be run before this next election, if in fact the liberals are going to gain, or even the Democrats are going to gain the narrative story that the country wants to hear.
And that, of course, is the well-renowned historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. We'll have more of her in a few minutes, talking about her new book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, a book we're offering up here in support of Background Briefing for a $150 donation. It's a